So I just finished the book of Exodus in my reading, and I thought I would do a brief update on our timeline, how far we've gotten so far in our chronology of events. So I put up this basic timeline of the Old Testament. And these dates given are by my own calculations. Several years ago I went through and I decided to make the timeline, calculate it as close as I could, based on two dates that we were given. Well, based on a number of dates, but it is centered on this one date right here. 600 BC, Lehi leaves Jerusalem. That's 600 years before the birth of Christ. It is also the first year of the reign of King Zedekiah. And from that point, we can then calculate everything else. So you'll note right here, this is my calculation. The fall occurred in 3937 BC. I was a little surprised at that myself. I thought it would have been closer to 4000, but 3937 BC. That's the fall. The city of Zion then is translated in 2952 BC, about 1,000 years later. The flood is in 2348. Remember, the year of the flood was the same year that Methuselah died. Methuselah lived 969 years, but he was born before the city was taken. So it's less than 1,000 years between the city of Zion being translated and the occurrence of the flood. Now, this is an interesting one. The Tower of Babel in the year 2008. That is 340 years after the flood. Abraham was already alive at this point. Abraham was alive during the Tower of Babel. He was about 50 years old, roughly. Then we come down here, we have Egypt. Israel enters Egypt in the year 1766. We have the Exodus in the year 1558. A little over 200 years later. It's like 208 years. Remember, I mentioned this in other videos, that while it says 430 years in Exodus, in Galatians it says 430 years from the time of the covenant, which would have been when Abraham received the covenant, to the Exodus, not from entering Israel. So 208 years that they were in Egypt. From the Exodus to the building of the building of the Temple of Solomon. Solomon's Temple is in 1078, almost 500 years later. Captivity in 600, and then of course Christ in the year 0. Well, there really was no year 0. It's just at the end of the period of the Old Testament we have the birth of Christ. This is the time period of the Old Testament. So let us look at the books that we've already gone through. First of all, let's do the first book in all scriptures, Genesis. What portion of time does Genesis take? Let's put this here, Genesis. Genesis, of course, begins with the fall, or actually begins with creation before the fall. But it extends all the way through here. That's actually just like the first 12 chapters of Genesis. Then we get the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the sons of Israel, ending with them entering Egypt, or a little bit after they enter Egypt. That is the time period of Genesis. Moses, which covers a similar or an overlapping time period, starts again with the fall, creation and fall, but it does not even get us all the way to the flood. It ends just before the flood. That's the time period of Moses. The book of Abraham begins with Abraham entering Egypt. That is after the Tower of Babel, so Abraham begins somewhere around here. This is approximately where Abraham is. Doesn't cover that much time, though. It only covers a very small portion of time. That's about Abraham. We've also read the book of Job, and as I discussed, we don't really know when Job takes place, but it most likely takes place after the Tower of Babel and before they enter Egypt. So we also have Job in this same approximate time period, but again, covering only a very tiny period of time. The only other book we've read so far has been portions of the book of Ether. The book of Ether begins over here with the Tower of Babel. So we can put in Ether starting somewhere in here. And Ether starts just before the tower. And remember, as I mentioned, what we have read in Ether so far brings us to approximately the Exodus. This is how far we've read so far, is the Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus, Ether actually continues, but we have not yet read this portion, will continue to just after the captivity, probably somewhere in here. That's about where the book of Ether will end. Its timeline will take us that far. It probably covers almost as much time as Genesis does. It probably has the longest timeline of any book in the scriptures other than Genesis. Genesis is the only book that covers a longer time span than the book of Ether. But we also did read Exodus. Exodus, of course, begins with the Exodus, or just before it. The Exodus covers only a very small portion of time, though, because in Exodus, they start their 40 years sojourning in the wilderness, but they never get out of it in Exodus. That's later. That's in Deuteronomy that the 40 years ends. So we have Exodus here. The next book, of course, is the Leviticus, which, let's just put that in, Leviticus, which will overlap slightly but come after Exodus. Then we will have Numbers, and that will again overlap slightly but come after Leviticus. Then we will have Deuteronomy, which will again overlap slightly but come after Numbers. These are the books of Moses. 4 books of Moses here plus Genesis. Those are our 5 books of Moses. These ones cover a very, very small portion of time. Very similar to Abraham and Job. They're very, very much confined in the time frame that they cover. These other books, these are all massive stories. These are the epics that carry you through generations. These ones are all the same generation, or 1 or 2 generations. And after Deuteronomy, we come to Joshua. And that will be approximately, that comes after all these books. And it covers only a slightly longer time period than these books do. Although it picks up right at the end of Deuteronomy. So this isn't to scale exactly. It's kind of hard to put it to scale on this. But now that I'm finished with Exodus, I'm going to return to Ether briefly. And I'm going to read Ether until we get to the time of the Judges. Just after Joshua, we will read this portion of Ether. Then I will go back and we will read Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Joshua. We'll read those 4 books next. Then I will probably read the Judges. The Judges will come next. However, I will also say the Judges will be next. It comes right after Joshua, and it covers about 240 years. But Ruth is during the time of the Judges. Matter of fact, by my calculation, it's right in the beginning of the Judges. So we will probably read the first 2 or 3 chapters of Judges, then we will read Ruth, then we will finish reading Judges. And then we will again return to Ether and read Ether in the time of the Judges. we'll see how this all works out. Ether is a bit harder to calculate when it's going to fall in, but we will try to get this period read, and then this period, and then we enter the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, or the time of the kings, the ending of Judges and the time of the kings. This is what we're working at right now. So we've read Genesis, we've read Moses, we've read Abraham, we've read Job, and we've read Exodus. We've read part, or about half, of the book of Ether. That brings us to Exodus, or to the end of the Exodus event. We will then move forward. This is the plan moving forward. Reading in Ether again until we catch up to Joshua, or to the time of the Judges. Then we will go back and read in the Old Testament, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. Then we will return to Ether, and then we will do Judges and Ruth. This is my plan moving forward, because this is how the timeline lines up. Once we get past the time of the Judges, then it gets a little tricky, because we have the histories of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles takes place at the same time as Samuel and Kings. And so we're going to be jumping, not just reading whole books like I've been doing. I've been trying to get primarily through whole books at this point. I did kind of blend Genesis and Moses and Abraham as they all were concurrent. Now we're going to have the time of the Kings. And Samuel, as I said, Samuel and the Kings are the same story. They're the same time period as the 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In addition, that's also the time period where most of the prophets lived. And so all those prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, all that stuff is during this time period of the Kings. That's when I'm really going to be jumping around, because it'll be like, Jeremiah began his preaching in the reign of Manasseh. That's down here, just a little bit before the captivity. But he preached, and his book is written from Manasseh through Ammon and through Josiah and all of his sons. He was the prophet. His book takes place over the reign of about 6 different kings. Isaiah, he was shortly before Jeremiah, primarily during the reign of Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. And, Jonah was during a certain prophet. So all these books will have to be fit into the timeline as we move along. And I will start jumping around a lot. I'll read a chapter in Samuel, maybe 2 or 3 chapters, and then read some stuff in Chronicles. I should probably start with Chronicles. But then we'll get to a point where Amos starts preaching. Well, we'll have to leave the histories and read Amos's works in the time period that they were written, or in the time period that Amos lived. That's where we're going to be really skipping around a lot, is when we get into the Kings. Once we get past the Kings, a lot of this stuff, we switch to the Book of Mormon, because this period, we have the captivity. We will have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They're all in here. But then we have this about 400 years where there's nothing in the Bible. And the only scriptures that have a record of this period is the Book of Mormon. So we'll read primarily from the Book of Mormon. Then we get in the New Testament era, and we'll switch between the New Testament and the Book of Mormon a bit. So this is the plan moving forward. I wanted to show this timeline and explain exactly what I am planning on doing as I move forward. But I think I've been rambling enough, so I will end it here, and we will get back to the reading in the next video.